The Standard Edition of the Complete Psychological Works of Sigmund Freud, Volume 14, translated and edited by James Strachey. Papers on Metapsychology, 1915. Papers on Psychology, Editor's Introduction. Freud published his first extended account of his views on psychological theory in the 7th chapter of The Interpretation of Dreams, 1900A, which incorporated, in a transmuted form, much of the substance of his earlier unpublished project, 1950A, 1895. Apart from occasional short discussions, such as the one in Chapter 6 of his book on jokes, 1905C, 10 years passed before he again began to enter deeply into theoretical problems. An exploratory paper on the two principles of mental functioning, 1911b, was followed by other more or less tentative approaches. In Part 3 of his Schreiber analysis, 1911c, in his English paper on the unconscious, 1912g, and in the long discussion of narcissism, 1914c. Finally, in the spring and summer of 1915, he once more undertook a full-length and systematic exposition of his psychological theories. The 5 papers which follow form an interconnected series. As we learn from a footnote to the 4th of them, page 222, they are part of a collection which Freud had originally planned to publish in book form under the title Zur Vorbereitung einer Metapsychologie, Preliminaries to a Metapsychology, footnote 1. In GS Volume 5, 1924, page 432, the paper written by Freud for the Society for Psychical Research, 1912G, is included under the rubric Papers on Metapsychology, along with the present 5 papers. It did not, however, form part of the original collection. He adds that the intention of the series was to provide a stable theoretical foundation for psychoanalysis. Though the first 3 of these papers were published in 1915 and the last 2 in 1917, we learn from Dr. Ernest Jones, 1955, page 208, that they were in fact all written in a period of some 7 weeks between March 15th and May 4th, 1915. We also learn from Dr. Jones, Ibid, page 209, that 7 more papers were added to the series during the following 3 months, the whole collection of 12 being completed by August 9th. These further 7 papers, however, were never published by Freud, and it seems probable that at some later date he destroyed them, for no trace of them has been found, and indeed their very existence was unknown or forgotten until Dr. Jones came to examine Freud's letters. At the time he was writing them in 1915, he kept his correspondents, Abraham, Ferenczi, and Jones, informed of his progress, but there seems to be only a single reference to them afterwards, in a letter to Abraham in November 1917. This must have been written at about the time of publication of the last 2 papers to appear, and it seems to imply that the 7 others were still in existence then, and that he still intended to publish them, though he felt that an opportune moment had not yet arrived. We are told the subjects with which 5 of the last 7 papers dealt: consciousness, anxiety, conversion hysteria, obsessional neurosis, and the transference neuroses in general, and we can detect possible references to them in the surviving papers. We can even guess the subjects which the 2 unspecified papers may have discussed, namely sublimation and projection, or paranoia. Footnote 1. In Part 3 of the Schreiber analysis, 1911c, Freud discussed the mechanism of projection, but professed himself dissatisfied and promised to consider it more fully in a later work. This he seems never to have done, unless it was in one of these missing papers. for there are fairly plain allusions to these. The collection of 12 papers would thus have been a comprehensive one, dealing with the underlying processes in most of the principal neuroses and psychoses: conversion hysteria, anxiety hysteria, obsessional neurosis, manic depressive insanity, and paranoia, as well as in dreams, with the mental mechanisms of repression, sublimation, introjection, and projection, and with the two mental systems of consciousness and the unconscious. It is difficult to exaggerate our loss from the disappearance of these papers. There was a unique conjunction of favorable factors at the time at which Freud wrote them. His previous major theoretical work, the 7th chapter of The Interpretation of Dreams, had been written 15 years before, at a relatively early stage of his psychological studies. Now, however, he had some 25 years of psychoanalytic experience behind him on which to base his theoretical constructions, while he remained at the summit of his intellectual powers. And it was at this time that the accidental circumstance of the shrinking of his practice owing to the outbreak of the First World War gave him the necessary leisure for 5 months in which to carry through his attempt. We may try to console ourselves, no doubt, with the reflection that much of the contents of the lost papers must have found its way into Freud's later writings, but we would give a great deal to possess connected discussions on such questions as consciousness or sublimation, in place of the scattered and relatively meager allusions with which we have in fact to rest satisfied. In view of the special importance of this series of papers, the closeness of their reasoning, and the occasional abstruseness of the topics with which they deal, particular efforts have been made to render them with accuracy. The translation has throughout, and especially where there are doubtful passages, been kept as close as possible to the German, even at the risk of its reading stiffly. Such un-English terms, for instance, as the repressed and the mental, have been freely used. Although the version published in 1925 has been taken as a basis, what follows is in effect an entirely new one. It has also seemed reasonable to include more than the usual quantity of introductory material, to annotate the text very freely, and in particular to give ample references to other parts of Freud's writings, which may throw light on any obscurities. A list of the most important of his theoretical works will be found in an appendix at the end of the series, page 259. Extracts from the translations published in 1925 of Instincts and Their Vicissitudes, Repression, and Mourning and Melancholia were included in Rickman's A General Selection from the Works of Sigmund Freud, 1937, pages 79 through 98, 99 through 110, and 142 through 161. Instincts and Their Vicissitudes, 1915, written by Sigmund Freud. From the Standard Edition of the Complete Psychological Works of Sigmund Freud, Volume 14, edited by James Strachey. Editor's Note: the present translation, though based on that of 1925, has been very largely rewritten. Freud began writing this paper on March 15, 1915. It and the following one, Repression, had been completed by April 4th. It should be remarked by way of preface that here and throughout the Standard Edition, the English word instinct stands for the German Trieb. The choice of this English equivalent, rather than such possible alternatives as drive or urge, is discussed in the general introduction to the first volume of the edition. The word instinct is in any case not used here in the sense which seems at the moment to be the most current among biologists. But Freud shows in the course of this paper the meaning which he attaches to the word so translated. Incidentally, on page 195 below, in the paper on the unconscious, he himself uses the German word instinct, though possibly in a rather different sense. There is, however, an ambiguity in Freud's use of the term Trieb, instinct, and Trieb representans, instinctual representative, to which, for the sake of clearer understanding, attention must be drawn. On pages 121 to 2, he describes an instinct as, quote, a concept on the frontier between the mental and the somatic, the psychical representative of the stimuli originating from within the organism and reaching the mind, end quote. Footnote 1. The German word here and in the Schreiber quotation is representant, a particularly formal word used mainly in legal or constitutional language. In all the other quotations which follow, as well as almost invariably later, Freud writes representants, which is a more abstract form and would be better rendered by representants if it existed, or by representation if it were not so exceedingly ambiguous. Vertretung, the ordinary German word for representation, appears in a parallel passage in the original text of Freud's Encyclopedia Britannica article, 1926F. In many places, Freud uses the compound Triebrepresentanz, which means representative of an instinct, but is usually abbreviated here into instinctual representative. Returning to the main text. On pages 121 to 2, he describes an instinct as, quote, a concept on the frontier between the mental and the somatic, the psychical representative of the stimuli originating from within the organism and reaching the mind, end quote. He had twice before given descriptions in almost the same words. Some years earlier, towards the end of section 3 of his discussion of the case of Schreiber, 1911c, he wrote of instinct as, quote, the concept on the frontier between the somatic and the mental, the psychical representative of organic forces, end quote. And again in a passage probably written a few months before the present paper and added to the third edition, published in 1915 but with a preface dated October 1914, of his 3 essays, 1905D, Standard Edition, Volume 7, page 168. He wrote of instinct as, quote, the psychical representative of an endosomatic, continuously flowing source of stimulation, a concept lying on the frontier between the mental and the physical, end quote. These 3 accounts seem to make it plain that Freud was drawing no distinction between an instinct and its psychical representative. He was apparently regarding the instinct itself as the psychical representative of somatic forces. If now, however, we turn to the later papers in this series, we seem to find him drawing a very sharp distinction between the instinct and its psychical representative. This is perhaps shown most clearly in a passage in The Unconscious, page 177. Quote, an instinct can never become an object of consciousness. Only the idea, Vorstellung, that represents the instinct can. Even in the unconscious, moreover, an instinct cannot be represented, otherwise than by an idea. When we nevertheless speak of an unconscious instinctual impulse, or of a repressed instinctual impulse, we can only mean an instinctual impulse, the ideational representative of which is unconscious, end quote. This same view appears in many other passages. For instance, in Repression, page 148, Freud speaks of, quote, the psychical ideational representative of the instinct, end quote, and goes on, quote, the representative in question persists unaltered, and the instinct remains attached to it, end quote. And again in the same paper, page 152, he writes of an instinctual representative as, quote, an idea or group of ideas which is connected with a definite quota of psychical energy, libido, interest, coming from an instinct, end quote, and proceeds to say that, quote, besides the idea, some other element representing the instinct has to be taken into account, end quote. In this second group of quotations, therefore, the instinct is no longer regarded as being the psychical representative of somatic impulses, but rather as itself being something non-psychical. Both of these apparently differing views of the nature of an instinct are to be found elsewhere in Freud's later writings, though the second predominates. It may be, however, that the contradiction is more apparent than real, and that its solution lies precisely in the ambiguity of the concept itself, a frontier concept between the physical and the mental. In a number of passages, Freud expressed his dissatisfaction with the state of psychological knowledge about the instincts. Not long before, for instance, in his paper on narcissism, 1914c, page 78 above, he had complained of, quote, the total absence of any theory of the instincts which would help us to find our bearings, end quote. Later, too, in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, 1920g, Standard Edition, Volume 18, page 34, he wrote of the instincts as, quote, at once the most important and the most obscure element of psychological research, end quote. And in his Encyclopedia Britannica article, 1926f, he confessed that, quote, for psychoanalysis too, the theory of the instincts is an obscure region, end quote. The present paper is a relatively early attempt to deal with the subject comprehensively. Its many successors corrected and supplemented it at a number of points, but it nevertheless holds the field as the clearest account of what Freud understood by the instincts, and of the way in which he thought they operated. Subsequent reflection, it is true, led him to alter his views on their classification, as well as on their deeper determinants. But this paper is an indispensable basis for understanding the developments that were to follow. The course of Freud's changing views on the classification of the instincts may perhaps be appropriately summarized here. It is a surprising fact that the instincts make their explicit appearance at a comparatively late point in the sequence of his writings. The word instinct is scarcely to be found in the works of the Brewer period, or in the Fleece correspondence, or even in the Interpretation of Dreams, 1900a. Not until the Three Essays, 1905d, is the sexual instinct freely mentioned as such. The instinctual impulses, which were to become one of Freud's commonest terms, seem not to appear till the paper on obsessive actions and religious practices, 1907b. Footnote 1. Treebrugungen. But this is mainly no more than a verbal point. The instincts were, of course, there under other names. Their place was taken to a great extent by such things as excitations, affective ideas, wishful impulses, endogenous stimuli, and so on. For instance, a distinction is drawn below, page 118, between a stimulus, which operates as a force giving a single impact, and an instinct, which always operates as a constant one. This precise distinction had been drawn by Freud 20 years earlier in almost identical words, except that instead of stimulus and instinct, he spoke of exogenous and endogenous excitations. Footnote 2. See the end of section 2 of Freud's first paper on anxiety neurosis, 1895b. For instance, a distinction is drawn below, page 118, between a stimulus, which operates as a force giving a single impact, and an instinct, which always operates as a constant one. This precise distinction had been drawn by Freud 20 years earlier in almost identical words, except that instead of stimulus and instinct, he spoke of exogenous and endogenous excitations. Similarly, Freud points out below, page 119, that the primitive organism cannot take evasive action against instinctual needs as it can against external stimuli. In this case, too, he had anticipated the idea 20 years before, though once again the term used was endogenous stimuli. The second passage in section 1 of part 1 of the Project, 1950a, 1895, goes on to say that these endogenous stimuli, quote, have their origin in the cells of the body and give rise to the major needs, hunger, respiration, and sexuality, end quote. But nowhere here is the actual word instinct to be found. The conflict which underlies the psychoneuroses was at this early period sometimes described as being between the ego and sexuality. And though the term libido was often used, the concept was of a manifestation of somatic sexual tension, which in its turn was regarded as a chemical event. Only in the three essays was libido explicitly established as an expression of the sexual instinct. The other party to the conflict, the ego, remained undefined for much longer. It was chiefly discussed in connection with its functions, in particular repression, resistance, and reality testing. But, apart from a very early attempt, in section 14 of part 1 of the project, little was said either of its structure or dynamics. Footnote 1. Confer the end of the editor's note to the paper on narcissism, page 71 above, and a discussion of reality testing in the editor's note to a metapsychological supplement to the theory of dreams, page 220 below. Returning to the main text. But apart from a very early attempt in section 14 of part 1 of the project, little was said either of its structure or dynamics. The self-preservative instincts had scarcely ever been referred to, except indirectly in connection with the theory that the libido had attached itself to them in the earlier phases of its development. Footnote 2. See, for instance, a passage in the 3 Essays, Standard Edition, Volume 7, pages 181 through 2, where, however, the explicit mention of self-preservation was added in 1915. The self-preservative instincts had scarcely ever been referred to, except indirectly in connection with the theory that the libido had attached itself to them in the earlier phases of its development. And there seemed no obvious reason for connecting them with the part played by the ego as the repressive agent in neurotic conflicts. Then, with apparent suddenness, in a short paper on psychogenic disturbance of vision, 1910I, Freud introduced the term ego instincts and identified these on the one hand with the self-preservative instincts and on the other with the repressive function. From this time forward, the conflict was regularly represented as being between two sets of instincts, the libido and the ego instincts. The introduction of the concept of narcissism, however, raised a complication. In his paper on that theory, 1914C, Freud advanced the notion of ego libido, or narcissistic libido, which cathects the ego, as contrasted with object libido, which cathects objects, page 76 above. A passage in that paper, as well as a remark in the present one, page 124, showed that he was already feeling uneasy as to whether his dualistic classification of the instincts would hold. It is true that in the Schreiber analysis, 1911C, he insisted on the difference between ego cathexes and libido, and between interest emanating from erotic sources and interest in general, a distinction which reappears in the rejoinder to Jung in the paper on narcissism, pages 80 through 1 above. The term interest is used again in the present paper, page 135, and in lecture 26 of the introductory lectures, 1916 to 17. Ego interest, or simply interest, is regularly contrasted with libido. Nevertheless, the exact nature of these non-libidinal instincts was obscure. The turning point in Freud's classification of the instincts was reached in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, 1920G. In chapter 6 of that work, he frankly recognized the difficulty of the position that had been reached, and explicitly declared that, quote, narcissistic libido was, of course, a manifestation of the force of the sexual instinct, and that it had to be identified with the self-preservative instincts. Standard Edition, Volume 18, page 50, and the following pages. He still held, however, that there were ego instincts and object instincts other than libidinal ones, and it was here that, still adhering to a dualistic view, he introduced his hypothesis of the death instinct. An account of the development of his views on the classification of the instincts up to that point was given in the long footnote at the end of chapter 6 of Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Standard Edition, Volume 18, pages 60 through 61, and a further discussion of the subject in the light of his newly completed picture of the structure of the mind, occupied Chapter 4 of The Ego and the Id, 1923b. He traversed the whole ground once again in much detail in Chapter 6 of Civilization and Its Discontents, 1930a, and he there, for the first time, gave a special consideration to the aggressive and destructive instincts. He had earlier paid little attention to these, except where, as in sadism and masochism, they were fused with libidinal elements. But he now discussed them in their pure form and explained them as derivatives of the death instinct. A still later review of the subject will be found in the second half of Lecture 32 of the new introductory lectures, 1933a, and a final summary in Chapter 2 of the posthumous Outline of Psychoanalysis, 1940a, 1938. Footnote 1. Some remarks on the destructive instinct and the possibility of its sublimation are contained in two letters of Freud's to Princess Marie Bonaparte of May 27 and June 17, 1937. They are printed in Appendix 1, numbers 34 and 35, of the third volume of Ernest Jones's biography, 1957. Instincts and their vicissitudes. We have often heard it maintained that sciences should be built up on clear and sharply defined basic concepts. In actual fact, no science, not even the most exact, begins with such definitions. The true beginning of scientific activity consists rather in describing phenomena, and then in proceeding to group, classify, and correlate them. Even at the stage of description, it is not possible to avoid applying certain abstract ideas to the material in hand. Ideas derived from somewhere or other, but certainly not from the new observations alone. Such ideas, which will later become the basic concepts of the science, are still more indispensable as the material is further worked over. They must at first necessarily possess some degree of indefiniteness. There can be no question of any clear delimitation of their content. So long as they remain in this condition, we come to an understanding about their meaning by making repeated references to the material of observation from which they appear to have been derived, but upon which, in fact, they have been imposed. Thus, strictly speaking, they are in the nature of conventions, although everything depends on their not being arbitrarily chosen, but determined by their having significant relations to the empirical material, relations that we seem to sense before we can clearly recognize and demonstrate them. It is only after more thorough investigation of the field of observation that we are able to formulate its basic scientific concepts with increased precision, and progressively so to modify them, that they become serviceable and consistent over a wide area. Then indeed the time may have come to confine them in definitions. The advance of knowledge, however, does not tolerate any rigidity even in definitions. Physics furnishes an excellent illustration of the way in which even basic concepts that have been established in the form of definitions are constantly being altered in their content. Footnote 1. A similar line of thought had been developed in the paper on Narcissism, 1914c, page 77 above. A conventional basic concept of this kind, which at the moment is still somewhat obscure, but which is indispensable to us in psychology, is that of an instinct. Footnote 1. Trieb in the original. See editor's note, page 111. Let us try to give a content to it by approaching it from different angles. First, from the angle of physiology. This has given us the concept of a stimulus and the pattern of the reflex arc, according to which a stimulus applied to living tissue, nervous substance, from the outside is discharged by action to the outside. This action is expedient insofar as it withdraws the stimulated substance from the influence of the stimulus, removes it out of its range of operation. What is the relation of instinct to stimulus? There is nothing to prevent our subsuming the concept of instinct under that of stimulus, and saying that an instinct is a stimulus applied to the mind. But we are immediately set on our guard against equating instinct and mental stimulus. There are obviously other stimuli in the mind beside those of an instinctual kind, stimuli which behave far more like physiological ones. For example, when a strong light falls on the eye, it is not an instinctual stimulus. It is one, however, when a dryness of the mucous membrane of the pharynx or an irritation of the mucous membrane of the stomach makes itself felt. Footnote 2. Assuming, of course, that these internal processes are the organic basis of the respective needs of thirst and hunger. We have now obtained the material necessary for distinguishing between instinctual stimuli and other physiological stimuli that operate on the mind. In the first place, an instinctual stimulus does not arise from the external world, but from within the organism itself. For this reason, it operates differently upon the mind, and different actions are necessary in order to remove it. Further, all that is essential in a stimulus is covered if we assume that it operates with a single impact, so that it can be disposed of by a single expedient action. A typical instance of this is motor flight from the source of stimulation. These impacts may, of course, be repeated and summated, but that makes no difference to our notion of the process and to the conditions for the removal of the stimulus. An instinct, on the other hand, never operates as a force giving a momentary impact, but always as a constant one. Moreover, since it impinges not from without, but from within the organism, no flight can avail against it. A better term for an instinctual stimulus is a need. What does away with a need is a satisfaction. This can be attained only by an appropriate, adequate alteration of the internal source of stimulation. Let us imagine ourselves in the situation of an almost entirely helpless living organism, as yet unoriented in the world, which is receiving stimuli in its nervous substance. The organism will very soon be in a position to make a first distinction and a first orientation. On the one hand, it will be aware of stimuli which can be avoided by muscular action, flight. These it ascribes to an external world. On the other hand, it will also be aware of stimuli against which such action is of no avail, and whose character of constant pressure persists in spite of it. These stimuli are the signs of an internal world, the evidence of instinctual needs. The perceptual substance of the living organism will thus have found in the efficacy of its muscular activity a basis for distinguishing between an outside and an inside. We thus arrive at the essential nature of instincts in the first place by considering their main characteristics, their origin and sources of stimulation within the organism, and their appearance as a constant force. And from this we deduce one of their further features, namely, that no actions of flight avail against them. In the course of this discussion, however, we cannot fail to be struck by something that obliges us to make a further admission. In order to guide us in dealing with the field of psychological phenomena, we do not merely apply certain conventions to our empirical material as basic concepts. We also make use of a number of complicated postulates. We have already alluded to the most important of these, and all we need now do is to state it expressly. The postulate is of a biological nature, and makes use of the concept of purpose, or perhaps of expediency, and runs as follows. The nervous system is an apparatus, which has the function of getting rid of the stimuli that reach it, or of reducing them to the lowest possible level, of which, if it were feasible, would maintain itself in an altogether unstimulated condition. Footnote 1. This is the principle of constancy. See footnote 1 above, page 119. Page 119, footnote 1. The hypothesis which follows concerning the behavior of a primitive living organism and the postulation of a fundamental principle of constancy have been stated in similar terms in some of the very earliest of Freud's psychological works. See, for instance, Chapter 7, Sections C and E of the Interpretation of Dreams, 1900A, Standard Edition 5, page 565 footnote and 598 footnote. But it had been expressed still earlier in neurological terms in his posthumously published Project of 1895, 1950A, Part 1, Section 1, as well as, more briefly, in his lecture on the Brewer and Freud Preliminary Communication, 1893H, and in the penultimate paragraph of his French paper on hysterical paralyses, 1893C. Freud returned to the hypothesis once more in chapters 1 and 4 of Beyond the Pleasure Principle, 1920G, Standard Edition, Volume 18, page 1 footnote and 26 footnote, and reconsidered it in The Economic Problem of Masochism, 1924C, confer footnote page 121 below, and footnote 2, see further below, page 134. Freud dealt with the subject later in his paper on negation, 1925H, and in Chapter 1 of Civilization and Its Discontents, 1930A. Returning to the main text. The nervous system is an apparatus which has a function of getting rid of the stimuli that reach it, or of reducing them to the lowest possible level, of which, if it were feasible, would maintain itself in an altogether unstimulated condition. Let us for the present not take exception to the indefiniteness of this idea, and let us assign to the nervous system the task, speaking in general terms, of mastering stimuli. We then see how greatly the simple pattern of the physiological reflex is complicated by the introduction of instincts. External stimuli impose only the single task of withdrawing from them. This is accomplished by muscular movements, one of which eventually achieves that aim and thereafter, being the expedient movement, becomes a hereditary disposition. Instinctual stimuli, which originate from within the organism, cannot be dealt with by this mechanism. Thus they make far higher demands on the nervous system, and cause it to undertake involved and interconnected activities by which the external world is so changed as to afford satisfaction to the internal source of stimulation. Above all, they oblige the nervous system to renounce its ideal intention of keeping off stimuli, for they maintain an incessant and unavoidable afflux of stimulation. We may therefore well conclude that instincts and not external stimuli are the true motive forces behind the advances that have led the nervous system, with its unlimited capacities, to its present high level of development. There is naturally nothing to prevent our supposing that the instincts themselves are, at least in part, precipitates of the effects of external stimulation, which in the course of phylogenesis have brought about modifications in the living substance. When we further find that the activity of even the most highly developed mental apparatus is subject to the pleasure principle, i.e. is automatically regulated by feelings belonging to the pleasure-unpleasure series, we can hardly reject the further hypothesis that these feelings reflect the manner in which the process of mastering stimuli takes place. Certainly, in the sense that unpleasurable feelings are connected with an increase and pleasurable feelings with a decrease of stimulus. We will, however, carefully preserve this assumption in its present highly indefinite form until we succeed, if that is possible, in discovering what sort of relation exists between pleasure and unpleasure on the one hand, and fluctuations in the amounts of stimulus affecting mental life on the other. It is certain that many various relations of this kind, and not very simple ones, are possible. Footnote 1. It will be seen that two principles are here involved. One of these is the principle of constancy, see above page 120 and footnote 1, page 119. It is stated again in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, 1920G, Chapter 1, Standard Edition, Volume 18, page 9, as follows, quote, "The mental apparatus endeavors to keep the quantity of excitations present in it as low as possible, or at least to keep it constant." End quote. For this principle, Freud in the same work, Ibid, page 56, adopted the term nirvana principle. The second principle involved is the pleasure principle, stated at the beginning of the paragraph to which this note is appended. It too is restated in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Ibid, page 7. Quote, "The course taken by mental events is automatically regulated by the pleasure principle. That course takes a direction such that its final outcome coincides with an avoidance of unpleasure or a production of pleasure." End quote. Freud seems to have assumed to begin with that these two principles were closely correlated and even identical. Thus, in his project of 1895, Freud, 1950a, Part 1, Section 8, he writes, quote, "Since we have certain knowledge of a trend in psychical life towards avoiding unpleasure, we are tempted to identify that trend with the primary trend towards inertia, i.e. towards avoiding excitation." End quote. A similar view is taken in Chapter 7e of the Interpretation of Dreams, 1900a, Standard Edition, Volume 5, page 598. In the passage in the text above, however, a doubt appears to be expressed as to the completeness of the correlation between the two principles. This doubt is carried farther and Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Standard Edition, Volume 18, pages 8 and 63, and is discussed at some length in The Economic Problem of Masochism, 1924c. Freud there argues that the two principles cannot be identical, since there are unquestionably states of increasing tension which are pleasurable, e.g. sexual excitement. And he goes on to suggest what had already been hinted at in the two passages in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, just referred to, that the pleasurable or unpleasurable quality of a state may be related to a temporal characteristic or rhythm of the changes in the quantity of excitation present. He concludes that in any case the two principles must not be regarded as identical. The pleasure principle is a modification of the nirvana principle. The nirvana principle, he maintains, is to be attributed to the death instinct, and its modification into the pleasure principle is due to the influence of the life instinct, or libido. Returning to the main text. If now we apply ourselves to considering mental life from a biological point of view, an instinct appears to us as a concept on the frontier between the mental and the somatic, as the psychical representative of the stimuli originating from within the organism and reaching the mind, as a measure of the demand made upon the mind for work in consequence of its connection with the body. Footnote 1. See the discussion in the editor's note, pages 111 through 13. We are now in a position to discuss certain terms which are used in reference to the concept of an instinct. For example, its pressure, its aim, its object, and its source. By the pressure drawn of an instinct, we understand its motor factor, the amount of force or the measure of the demand for work which it represents. The characteristic of exercising pressure is common to all instincts. It is in fact their very essence. Every instinct is a piece of activity. If we speak loosely of passive instincts, we can only mean instincts whose aim is passive. Footnote 2. Some remarks on the active nature of instincts will be found in a footnote added in 1915 to section 4 of the third of Freud's three essays, 1905d, Standard Edition, Volume 7, page 219. A criticism of Adler for misunderstanding this pressing characteristic of instincts appears at the end of the second section of Part 3 of the Little Hans Analysis, 1909b, Standard Edition, Volume 10, pages 140 through 41. Returning to the main text. The aim, zeal, of an instinct is in every instance satisfaction, which can only be obtained by removing the state of stimulation at the source of the instinct. But although the ultimate aim of each instinct remains unchangeable, there may yet be different paths leading to the same ultimate aim, so that an instinct may be found to have various nearer or intermediate aims, which are combined or interchanged with one another. Experience permits us also to speak of instincts which are inhibited in their aim. In the case of processes which are allowed to make some advance towards instinctual satisfaction, but are then inhibited or deflected. We may suppose that even processes of this kind involve a partial satisfaction. The object of an instinct is the thing in regard to which or through which the instinct is able to achieve its aim. It is what is most variable about an instinct, and is not originally connected with it, but becomes assigned to it only in consequence of being peculiarly fitted to make satisfaction possible. The object is not necessarily something extraneous. It may equally well be a part of the subject's own body. It may be changed any number of times in the course of the vicissitudes which the instinct undergoes during its existence. And highly important parts are played by this displacement of instinct. It may happen that the same object serves for the satisfaction of several instincts simultaneously, a phenomenon which Adler, 1908, has called a confluence of instincts. Triebverschränkung. Footnote 1. Two instances of this are given by Freud in the Analysis of Little Hans, 1909b, Standard Edition, Volume 10, pages 106 and 127. A particularly close attachment of the instinct to its object is distinguished by the term fixation. This frequently occurs at very early periods of the development of an instinct and puts an end to its mobility through its intense opposition to detachment. Footnote 2, confer below, page 148. By the source, quell, of an instinct is meant the somatic process which occurs in an organ or part of the body, and whose stimulus is represented in mental life by an instinct. We do not know whether this process is invariably of a chemical nature, or whether it may also correspond to the release of other, e.g. mechanical, forces. The study of the sources of instincts lies outside the scope of psychology. Although instincts are wholly determined by their origin in a somatic source, in mental life we know them only by their aims. An exact knowledge of the sources of an instinct is not invariably necessary for purposes of psychological investigation. Sometimes its source may be inferred from its aim. Are we to suppose that the different instincts which originate in the body and operate on the mind are also distinguished by different qualities, and that this is why they behave in qualitatively different ways in mental life? This supposition does not seem to be justified. We are much more likely to find the simpler assumption sufficient, that the instincts are all qualitatively alike, and owe the effect they make only to the amount of excitation they carry, or perhaps in addition to certain functions of that quantity. What distinguishes from one another the mental effects produced by the various instincts may be traced to the difference in their sources. In any event, it is only in a later connection that we shall be able to make plain what the problem of the quality of instincts signifies. Footnote 3. It is not clear what later connection Freud had in mind. There is obviously a wide opportunity here for arbitrary choice. No objection can be made to anyone's employing the concept of an instinct of play, or of destruction, or of gregariousness, when the subject matter demands it, and the limitations of psychological analysis allows of it. Nevertheless, we should not neglect to ask ourselves whether instinctual motives like these, which are so highly specialized on the one hand, do not admit of further dissection in accordance with the sources of the instinct, so that only primal instincts, those which cannot be further dissected, can lay claim to importance. I have proposed that two groups of such primal instincts should be distinguished: the ego or self-preservative instincts and the sexual instincts. But this supposition has not the status of a necessary postulate, as has, for instance, our assumption about the biological purpose of the mental apparatus, page 120. It is merely a working hypothesis, to be retained only so long as it proves useful, and it will make little difference to the results of our work of description and classification if it is replaced by another. The occasion for this hypothesis arose in the course of the evolution of psychoanalysis, which was first employed upon the psychoneuroses, or more precisely, upon the group described as transference neuroses, hysteria and obsessional neurosis. These showed that at the root of all such affections there is to be found a conflict between the claims of sexuality and those of the ego. It is always possible that an exhaustive study of the other neurotic affections, especially of the narcissistic psychoneuroses, the schizophrenias, may oblige us to alter this formula and to make a different classification of the primal instincts. But for the present we do not know of any such formula, nor have we met with any argument unfavorable to drawing this contrast between sexual and ego instincts. Footnote 1. See the editor's note, page 115. I am altogether doubtful whether any decisive pointers for the differentiation and classification of the instincts can be arrived at on the basis of working over the psychological material. This working over seems rather to call for the application to the material of definite assumptions concerning instinctual life, and it would be a desirable thing if those assumptions could be taken from some other branch of knowledge and carried over to psychology. The contribution which biology has to make here certainly does not run counter to the distinction between sexual and ego instincts. Biology teaches that sexuality is not to be put on par with other functions of the individual, for its purposes go beyond the individual and have as their content the production of new individuals, that is, the preservation of the species. It shows further that two views, seemingly equally well-founded, may be taken of the relation between the ego and sexuality. On the one view, the individual is the principal thing, sexuality is one of its activities, and sexual satisfaction one of its needs, while on the other view, the individual is a temporary and transient appendage to the quasi-immortal germplasm, which is entrusted to him by the process of generation. Footnote 1. See footnote page 78 above. The same point is made near the beginning of Lecture 26 of the Introductory Lectures, 1916 through 17. The hypothesis that the sexual function differs from other bodily processes in virtue of a special chemistry is, I understand, also a postulate of the Ehrlich school of biological research. Footnote 2. This hypothesis had already been announced by Freud in the first edition of his 3 essays, 1905D, Standard Edition, Volume 7, page 216, note. But he had held it for at least 10 years previously. See, for instance, Draft 1 in the Fleece Correspondence, 1950A, probably written in 1895. Since a study of instinctual life from the direction of consciousness presents almost insuperable difficulties, the principal source of our knowledge remains the psychoanalytic investigation of mental disturbances. Psychoanalysis, however, in consequence of the course taken by its development, has hitherto been able to give us information of a fairly satisfactory nature only about the sexual instincts, for it is precisely that group which alone can be observed in isolation, as it were, in the psychoneuroses. With the extension of psychoanalysis to the other neurotic affections, we shall no doubt find a basis for our knowledge of the ego instincts as well, though it would be rash to expect equally favorable conditions for observation in this further field of research. This much can be said by way of a general characterization of the sexual instincts. They are numerous, emanate from a great variety of organic sources, act in the first instance independently of one another, and only achieve a more or less complete synthesis at a late stage. The aim which each of them strives for is the attainment of organ pleasure. Footnote 1. Organ pleasure, i.e. pleasure attached to one particular bodily organ, seems to be used here for the first time by Freud. The term is discussed at greater length in the early part of Lecture 21 of the Introductory Lectures, 1916 to 17. The underlying idea, of course, goes back much earlier. See, for instance, the opening passage of the third of the 3 essays, 1905D, Standard Edition, Volume 7, page 207. Only when synthesis is achieved do they enter the service of the reproductive function, and thereupon become generally recognizable as sexual instincts. At their first appearance, they are attached to the instincts of self-preservation, from which they only gradually become separated. In their choice of object, too, they follow the paths that are indicated to them by the ego instincts. Footnote 2. Confer on Narcissism, page 87 above. A portion of them remains associated with the ego instincts throughout life and furnishes them with libidinal components, which in normal functioning easily escape notice and are revealed clearly only by the onset of illness. Footnote 3, Ibid, page 82 above. They are distinguished by possessing the capacity to act vicariously for one another to a wide extent, and by being able to change their objects readily. In consequence of the latter properties, they are capable of functions which are far removed from their original purpose of actions, capable, that is, of sublimation. Our inquiry into the various vicissitudes which instincts undergo in the process of development and in the course of life must be confined to the sexual instincts, which are the more familiar to us. Observation shows us that an instinct may undergo the following vicissitudes: reversal into its opposite, turning round upon the subject's own self, repression, sublimation. Since I do not intend to treat of sublimation here, and since repression requires a special chapter to itself, confer next paper, page 146, it only remains for us to describe and discuss the two first points. Footnote 4. Sublimation had already been touched upon in the paper on Narcissism, pages 94 through 5, but it seems possible that it formed the subject of one of the lost metapsychological papers. See editor's introduction, page 106. Bearing in mind that there are motive forces which work against an instinct's being carried through in an unmodified form, we may also regard these vicissitudes as modes of defense against the instincts. Reversal of an instinct into its opposite resolves on closer examination into two different processes: a change from activity to passivity, and a reversal of its content. The two processes, being different in their nature, must be treated separately. Examples of the first process are met with in the two pairs of opposites, sadism and masochism, and scopophilia, exhibitionism. The reversal affects only the aims of the instincts. The active aim, to torture, to look at, is replaced by the passive aim, to be tortured, to be looked at. Reversal of content is found in the single instance of the transformation of love into hate. The turning round of an instinct upon the subject's own self is made plausible by the reflection that masochism is actually sadism, turned around upon the subject's own ego, and that exhibitionism includes looking at his own body. Analytic observation, indeed, leaves us in no doubt that the masochist shares in the enjoyment of the assault upon himself, and that the exhibitionist shares in the enjoyment of the sight of his exposure. The essence of the process is thus the change of the object, while the aim remains unchanged. We cannot fail to notice, however, that in these examples the turning round upon the subject's self and the transformation from activity to passivity converge or coincide. To elucidate the situation, a more thorough investigation is essential. In the case of the pair of opposites, sadism-masochism, the process may be represented as follows. A. Sadism consists in the exercise of violence or power upon some other person as object. B. The object is given up and replaced by the subject's self. With the turning round upon the self, the change from an active to a passive instinctual aim is also effected. C. An extraneous person is once more sought as object. This person, in consequence of the alteration which has taken place in the instinctual aim, has to take over the role of the subject. Footnote 1. Though the general sense of these passages is clear, there may be some confusion in the use of the word subject. As a rule, subject and object are used respectively for the person in whom an instinct or other state of mind originates, and the person or thing to which it is directed. Here, however, subject seems to be used for the person who plays the active part in the relationship, the agent. The word is more obviously used in this sense in the parallel passage on page 129 and elsewhere below. Returning to the main text. Case C is what is commonly termed masochism. Here, too, satisfaction follows along the path of the original sadism, the passive ego placing itself back in fantasy in its first role, which has now in fact been taken over by the extraneous subject. Footnote 1, see last footnote. Whether there is, besides this, a more direct masochistic satisfaction is highly doubtful. A primary masochism, not derived from sadism in the manner I have described, seems not to be met with. Footnote 2. Footnote added 1924. In later works, confer The Economic Problem of Masochism, 1924c, relating to problems of instinctual life, I have expressed an opposite view. That it is not superfluous to assume the existence of stage B is to be seen from the behavior of the sadistic instinct in obsessional neurosis. There is a turning round upon the subject's self without an attitude of passivity towards another person. The change has only got as far as stage B. The desire to torture has turned into self-torture and self-punishment, not into masochism. The active voice is changed, not into the passive, but into the reflexive middle voice. Footnote 3. The allusion here is to the voices of the Greek verb. Our view of sadism is further prejudiced by the circumstance that this instinct, side by side with its general aim, or perhaps rather within it, seems to strive towards the accomplishment of a quite special aim, not only to humiliate and master, but in addition to inflict pains. Psychoanalysis would appear to show that the infliction of pain plays no part among the original purposive actions of the instinct. A sadistic child takes no account of whether or not he inflicts pains, nor does he intend to do so. But when once the transformation into masochism has taken place, the pains are very well fitted to provide a passive masochistic aim. For we have every reason to believe that sensations of pain, like other unpleasurable sensations, trench upon sexual excitation and produce a pleasurable condition, for the sake of which the subject will even willingly experience the unpleasure of pain. Footnote 4. See a passage near the end of the second of the three essays, 1905d, Standard Edition, Volume 7, pages 203 through 4. When once feeling pains has become a masochistic aim, the sadistic aim of causing pains can arise also, retrogressively. For while these pains are being inflicted on other people, they are enjoyed masochistically by the subject through his identification of himself with the suffering object. In both cases, of course, it is not the pain itself which is enjoyed, but the accompanying sexual excitation, so that this can be done especially conveniently from the sadistic position. The enjoyment of pain would thus be an aim which was originally masochistic, but which can only become an instinctual aim in someone who was originally sadistic. For the sake of completeness, I may add that feelings of pity cannot be described as a result of a transformation of instinct occurring in sadism, but necessitate the notion of a reaction formation against the instinct. For the difference, see later. Footnote 1. It is not clear to what passage this is intended to refer, unless again it was included in a missing paper on sublimation. There is in fact some discussion of the subject in Thoughts for the Times on War and Death, 1915b, page 281 below. But this cannot have been what Freud had in mind, for it was originally published in a different volume. In a footnote added in 1915, the year in which the present paper was written, to the three essays, 1905d, Freud insists that sublimation and reaction formation are to be regarded as distinct processes. Standard Edition, Volume 7, page 178, footnote. The German word for pity is Mitleid, literally suffering with compassion. Another view of the origin of the feeling is expressed in the Wolfman analysis, 1918b, Standard Edition, Volume 17, page 88, which was actually written, in all probability, at the end of 1914, a few months earlier than the present paper. Returning to the main text. For the sake of completeness, I may add that feelings of pity cannot be described as a result of transformation of a transformation of instinct occurring in sadism, but necessitate the notion of a reaction formation against that instinct. For the difference, see later. Rather, different and simpler findings are afforded by the investigation of another pair of opposites, the instincts whose respective aim is to look and to display oneself, scopophilia and exhibitionism, in the language of the perversions. Here again we may postulate the same stages as in the previous instance. A. Looking as an activity directed towards an extraneous object. B. Giving up of the object and turning of the scopophilic interest and instinct towards a part of the subject's own body. With this transformation to passivity and setting up a new aim, that of being looked at. C. Introduction of a new subject to whom one displays oneself in order to be looked at by him. Here too it can hardly be doubted that the active aim appears before the passive, that looking precedes being looked at. Footnote 1. Footnote 2, i.e. agent. See footnote on pages 127 through 8. Here too it can hardly be doubted that the active aim appears before the passive, that looking precedes being looked at. But there is an apparent important divergence from what happens in the case of sadism, and that we can recognize in the case of the scopophilic instinct a yet earlier stage than that described as A. For the beginning of its activity, the scopophilic instinct is autoerotic. It has indeed an object, but that object is part of the subject's own body. It is only later that the instinct is led by a process of comparison to exchange this object for an analogous part of someone else's body. Stage A. This preliminary stage is interesting because it is the source of both the situations represented in the resulting pair of opposites, the one or the other according to which element in the original situation is changed. The following might serve as a diagrammatic picture of the scopophilic instinct. A. Alpha, oneself looking at a sexual organ, equals a sexual organ being looked at by oneself. Beta, oneself looking at an extraneous object, active scopophilia. An object which is oneself or part of oneself being looked at by an extraneous person, exhibitionism. A preliminary stage of this kind is absent in sadism, which from the outset is directed upon an extraneous object, although it might not be altogether unreasonable to construct such a stage out of the child's efforts to gain control over his own limbs. Footnote 1. Footnote added 1924. Confer footnote 2, page 128. With regard to both the instincts which we have just taken as examples, it should be remarked that their transformation by a reversal from activity to passivity and by a turning round upon the subject never in fact involves the whole quota of the instinctual impulse. The earlier active direction of the instinct persists to some degree side by side with its later passive direction, even when the process of its transformation has been very extensive. The only correct statement to make about the scopophilic instinct would be that all the stages of its development, its autoerotic preliminary stage, as well as its final active or passive form, coexist alongside one another. And the truth of this becomes obvious if we base our opinion not on the actions to which the instinct leads, but on the mechanism of its satisfaction. Perhaps, however, it is permissible to look at the matter and represent it in yet another way. We can divide the life of each instinct into a series of separate successive waves, each of which is homogeneous during whatever period of time it may last, and whose relation to one another is comparable to that of successive eruptions of lava. We can then perhaps picture the first original eruption of the instinct as proceeding in an unchanged form and undergoing no development at all. The next wave would be modified from the outset, being turned, for instance, from active to passive, and would then, with this new characteristic, be added to the earlier wave, and so on. If we were then to take a survey of the instinctual impulse from its beginning up to a given point, the succession of waves which we have described would inevitably present the picture of a definite development of the instinct. The fact that, at this later period of development of an instinctual impulse, its passive opposite may be observed alongside of it, deserves to be marked by the very apt term introduced by Bleuler, ambivalence. Footnote 1. Jenner, in the first edition only. Jetter, every, at this later period, and at every later period of development. Footnote 2. The term ambivalence, coined by Bleuler, 1910b and 1911, pages 43 and 305, seems not to have been used by him in this sense. He distinguished three kinds of ambivalence. 1. Emotional, i.e., oscillation between love and hate. 2. Voluntary, i.e., inability to decide on an action. And 3. Intellectual, i.e., belief in contradictory propositions. Freud generally uses the term in the first of these three senses. See, for instance, the first occasion on which he seems to have adopted it, near the end of his paper on the dynamics of transference, 1912b, and later in the present paper, pages 133 and 139. The passage in the text is one of the very few in which he has applied the term to activity and passivity. For another instance of this exceptional use, see a passage in section 3 of the Wolfman case history, 1918b, Standard Edition, Volume 17, page 26. This reference to the developmental history of instincts and the permanence of their intermediate stages should make the development of instincts fairly intelligible to us. Experience shows that the amount of demonstrable ambivalence varies greatly between individuals, groups, and races. Marked instinctual ambivalence in a human being living at the present day may be regarded as an archaic inheritance, for we have reason to suppose that the part played in instinctual life by the active impulses in their unmodified form was greater in primeval times than it is on an average today. Footnote 3. See Totem and Taboo, 1912-13, Standard Edition, Volume 13, page 66. We have become accustomed to call the early phase of the development of the ego, during which its sexual instincts find autoerotic satisfaction, narcissism, without at once entering on any discussion of the relation between autoerotism and narcissism. It follows that the preliminary stage of the scopophilic instinct, in which the subject's own body is the object of the scopophilia, must be classed under narcissism, and that we must describe it as a narcissistic formation. The active scopophilic instinct develops from this by leaving narcissism behind. The passive scopophilic instinct, on the contrary, holds fast to the narcissistic object. Similarly, the transformation of sadism into masochism implies a return to the narcissistic object, and in both these cases, i.e. in passive scopophilia and masochism, the narcissistic subject is, through identification, replaced by another extraneous ego. If we take into account our constructed preliminary narcissistic stage of sadism, we shall be approaching a more general realization, namely, that the instinctual vicissitudes, which consist in the instincts being turned around upon the subject's own ego and undergoing reversal from activity to passivity, are dependent on the narcissistic organization of the ego and bear the stamp of that phase. They perhaps correspond to the attempts at defense, which at higher stages of the development of the ego are effected by other means. See above pages 126 through 7. At this point, we may call to mind that so far we have considered only two pairs of opposite instincts, sadism masochism and scopophilia exhibitionism. These are the best known sexual instincts that appear in an ambivalent manner. The other components of the later sexual function are not yet sufficiently accessible to analysis for us to be able to discuss them in a similar way. In general, we can assert of them that their activities are autoerotic, that is to say, their object is negligible in comparison with the organ which is their source, and as a rule coincides with that organ. The object of the scopophilic instinct, however, though it too is in the first instance a part of the subject's own body, is not the I itself, and in sadism, the organic source, which is probably the muscular apparatus with its capacity for action, points unequivocally at an object other than itself, even though that object is part of the subject's own body. In the autoerotic instincts, the part played by the organic source is so decisive that, according to a plausible suggestion of Federn, 1913, and Jekyll's, 1913, the form and function of the organ determine the activity or passivity of the instinctual aim. The change of the content, confer page 127, of an instinct into its opposite is observed in a single instance only, the transformation of love into hate. Footnote 1. In the German editions previous to 1924, this reads the transformation of love and hate. Since it is particularly common to find both these directed simultaneously toward the same object, their coexistence furnishes the most important example of ambivalence of feeling. See page 131, note 2. The case of love and hate acquires a special interest from the circumstance that it refuses to be fitted into our scheme of the instincts. It is impossible to doubt that there is the most intimate relation between these two opposite feelings and sexual life, but we are naturally unwilling to think of love as being some kind of special component instinct of sexuality in the same way as the others we have been discussing. We should prefer to regard loving as the expression of the whole sexual current of feeling. But this idea does not clear up our difficulties, and we cannot see what meaning to attach to an opposite content of this current. Loving admits not merely of one, but of three opposites. In addition to the antithesis loving, hating, there is the other one of loving, being loved. In addition to these, loving and hating taken together are the opposite of the condition of unconcern or indifference. The second of these three antitheses, loving, being loved, corresponds exactly to the transformation from activity to passivity, and may be traced to an underlying situation in the same way as in the case of the scopophilic instinct. This situation is that of loving oneself, which we regard as the characteristic feature of narcissism. Then, according as the object or the subject is replaced by an extraneous one, what results is the active aim of loving, or the passive one of being loved, the latter remaining near to narcissism. Perhaps we shall come to a better understanding of the several opposites of loving if we reflect that our mental life as a whole is governed by three polarities: the antitheses, subject or ego, and object or external world, pleasure, unpleasure, and active, passive. The antithesis ego, non-ego, external, i.e. subject-object, is, as we have already said, page 119, thrust upon the individual organism at an early stage by the experience that it can silence external stimuli by means of muscular action, but is defenseless against instinctual stimuli. This antithesis remains, above all, sovereign in our intellectual activity, and creates for research the basic situation which no efforts can alter. The polarity of pleasure-unpleasure is attached to a scale of feelings, whose paramount importance in determining our actions, our will, has already been emphasized, pages 120 to 21. The antithesis active-passive must not be confused with the antithesis ego-subject, external world-object. The relation of the ego to the external world is passive insofar as it receives stimuli from it, and active when it reacts to these. It is forced by its instincts into a quite special degree of activity towards the external world, so that we might bring out the essential point if we say that the ego subject is passive in respect of external stimuli, but active through its own instincts. The antithesis active-passive coalesces later with the antithesis masculine-feminine, which until this has taken place, has no psychological meaning. The coupling of activity with masculinity and of passivity with femininity meets us indeed as a biological fact, but it is by no means so invariably complete and exclusive as we are inclined to assume. Footnote 1. This question is discussed at much greater length in a footnote added in 1915, the year in which the present paper was written, to the third of Freud's three essays, 1905D, Standard Edition Volume 7, page 219, and other pages. See also page 55 above. The three polarities of the mind are connected with one another in various highly significant ways. There is a primal psychical situation in which two of them coincide. Originally, at the very beginning of mental life, the ego is cathected with instincts and is to some extent capable of satisfying them on itself. We call this condition narcissism, and this way of obtaining satisfaction autoerotic. Footnote 2. Some of the sexual instincts are, as we know, capable of this autoerotic satisfaction, and so are adapted to being the vehicle for the development, under the dominance of the pleasure principle, from the original reality ego into the pleasure ego, which we are about to describe in the next paragraphs of the text. Those sexual instincts, which from the outset require an object, and the needs of the ego instincts, which are never capable of autoerotic satisfaction, naturally disturb this state of primal narcissism, and so pave the way for an advance from it. Indeed, the primal narcissistic state would not be able to follow the development that is to be described if it were not for the fact that every individual passes through a period during which he is helpless and has to be looked after, and during which his pressing needs are satisfied by an external agency, and are thus prevented from becoming greater. This very condensed footnote might have been easier to understand if it had been placed 2 or 3 paragraphs further on. It may perhaps be expanded as follows. In his paper on the 2 Principles of Mental Functioning, 1911b, Freud had introduced the idea of the transformation of an early pleasure ego into a reality ego. In the passage which follows in the text above, he argues that there is in fact a still earlier original reality ego. This original reality ego, instead of proceeding directly into the final reality ego, is replaced, under the dominating influence of the pleasure principle, by a pleasure ego. The footnote enumerates those factors, on the one hand, which would favor this latter turn of events, and those factors, on the other hand, which would work against it. The existence of autoerotic libidinal instincts would encourage the diversion to a pleasure ego, while the non-autoerotic libidinal instincts and the self-preservative instincts would be likely, instead, to bring about a direct transition to the final adult reality ego. This latter result would, he remarks, in fact come about, if it were not that parental care of the helpless infant satisfies this second set of instincts, artificially prolongs the primary state of narcissism, and so helps to make the establishment of the pleasure ego possible. Returning to the main text. We call this condition narcissism, and this way of obtaining satisfaction autoerotic. At this time, the external world is not cathected with interest in a general sense, and is indifferent for purposes of satisfaction. During this period, therefore, the ego subject coincides with what is pleasurable, and the external world with what is indifferent, or possibly unpleasurable, as being a source of stimulation. If for the moment we define loving as the relation of the ego to its sources of pleasure, the situation in which the ego loves itself only and is indifferent to the external world illustrates the first of the opposites which we found to loving. Footnote 1. On page 133, Freud enumerates the opposites of loving in the following order: 1. Hating, 2. Being loved, and 3. Indifference. In the present passage, and below on pages 136 and 139, he adopts a different order: 1. Indifference, 2. Hating, 3. Being loved. It seems probable that in this second arrangement he gives indifference the first place, as being the first to appear in the course of development. Returning to the main text. Insofar as the ego is autoerotic, it has no need of the external world, but in consequence of experiences undergone by the instincts of self-preservation, it acquires objects from that world, and in spite of everything, it cannot avoid feeling internal instinctual stimuli for a time as unpleasurable. Under the dominance of the pleasure principle, a further development now takes place in the ego. Insofar as the objects which are presented to it are sources of pleasure, it takes them into itself, introjects them, to use Ferenzi's 1909 term, and on the other hand, it expels whatever within itself becomes a cause of unpleasure. Footnote 1. This seems to be the first occasion on which Freud himself used the term introjects. Confer the footnote on page 241 below. And on the other hand, it expels whatever within itself becomes a cause of unpleasure. See below pages 184 and 224, the mechanism of projection. Thus, the original reality ego, which distinguishes internal and external by means of a sound objective criterion, changes into a purified pleasure ego, which places the characteristic of pleasure above all others. Footnote 2. See above page 119 and footnote 2. The reality ego and the pleasure ego had already been introduced in the paper on the two principles of mental functioning, 1911b. Thus, the original reality ego, which distinguished internal and external by means of a sound objective criterion, changes into a purified pleasure ego, which places the characteristic of pleasure above all others. For the pleasure ego, the external world is divided into a part that is pleasurable, which it has incorporated into itself, and a remainder that is extraneous to it. It has separated off a part of its own self, which it projects into the external world, and feels as hostile. After this new arrangement, the two polarities coincide once more. The ego subject coincides with pleasure, and the external world with unpleasure, with what was earlier indifference. When, during the stage of primary narcissism, the object makes its appearance, the second opposite to loving, namely hating, also attains its development. Footnote 3. See footnote 1, page 135. When, during the stage of primary narcissism, the object makes its appearance, the second opposite to loving, namely hating, also attains its development. As we have seen, the object is brought to the ego from the external world, in the first instance by the instincts of self-preservation, and it cannot be denied that hating, too, originally characterized the relation of the ego to the alien external world with the stimuli it introduces. Indifference falls into place as a special case of hate or dislike, after having first appeared as their forerunner. At the very beginning, it seems, the external world, objects, and what is hated are identical. If later on an object turns out to be a source of pleasure, it is loved, but it is also incorporated into the ego, so that for the purified pleasure ego, once again objects coincide with what is extraneous and hated. Now, however, we may note that just as the pair of opposites, love and difference, reflects the polarity ego, external world, so the second antithesis, love-hate, reproduces the polarity, pleasure-unpleasure, which is linked to the first polarity. Footnote 3. See footnote 1, page 135. When the purely narcissistic stage has given place to the object stage, pleasure and unpleasure signify relations of the ego to the object. If the object becomes a source of pleasurable feelings, a motor urge is set up which seeks to bring the object closer to the ego and to incorporate it into the ego. We then speak of the attraction exercised by the pleasure-giving object and say that we love that object. Conversely, if the object is a source of unpleasurable feelings, there is an urge which endeavors to increase the distance between the object and the ego, and to repeat, in relation to the object, the original attempt at flight from the external world, with its emission of stimuli. We feel the repulsion of the object and hate it. This hate can afterwards be intensified to the point of an aggressive inclination against the object and intention to destroy it. We might at a pinch say of an instinct that it loves the objects toward which it strives for purposes of satisfaction. But to say that an instinct hates an object strikes us as odd. Thus we become aware that the attitudes of love and hate cannot be made use of for the relations of instincts to their objects, but are reserved for the relations of the total ego to objects. Footnote 1. German Beziehungen, literally relations. In the first edition, this word is printed Bezeichnungen, descriptions or terms, which seems to make better sense. The word relations in the later part of the sentence stands for Relationen in the German text. We might at a pinch say of an instinct that it loves the objects toward which it strives for purposes of satisfaction. But to say that an instinct hates an object strikes us as odd. Thus, we become aware that the attitudes of love and hate cannot be made use of for the relations of instincts to their objects, but are reserved for the relations of the total ego to objects. But if we consider linguistic usage, which is certainly not without significance, we shall see that there is a further limitation to the meaning of love and hate. We do not say of objects which serve the interests of self-preservation that we love them. We emphasize the fact that we need them, and perhaps express an additional different kind of relation to them by using words that denote a much reduced degree of love, such as, for example, being fond of, liking, or finding agreeable. Thus the word to love moves further and further into the sphere of the pure pleasure relation of the ego to the object, and finally becomes fixed to sexual objects in the narrower sense, and to those which satisfy the needs of sublimated sexual instincts. The distinction between the ego instincts and the sexual instincts, which we have imposed upon our psychology, is thus seen to be in conformity with the spirit of our language. The fact that we are not in the habit of saying of a single sexual instinct that it loves its object, but regard the relation of the ego to its sexual object as the most appropriate case in which to employ the word love, this fact teaches us that the word can only begin to be applied in this relation after there has been a synthesis of all the component instincts of sexuality under the primacy of the genitals and in the service of the reproductive function. It is noteworthy that in the use of the word hate, no such intimate connection with sexual pleasure and the sexual function appears. The relation of unpleasure seems to be the sole decisive one. The ego hates, abhors, and pursues with intent to destroy all objects which are a source of unpleasurable feeling for it, without taking into account whether they mean a frustration of sexual satisfaction or of the satisfaction of self-preservative needs. Indeed, it may be asserted that the true prototypes of the relation of hate are derived not from sexual life, but from the ego's struggles to preserve and maintain itself. So we see that love and hate, which present themselves to us as complete opposites in their content, do not after all stand in any simple relation to each other. They did not arise from the cleavage of any originally common entity, but sprang from different sources, and had each its own development before the influence of the pleasure-unpleasure relation made them into opposites. It now remains for us to put together what we know of the genesis of love and hate. Love is derived from the capacity of the ego to satisfy some of its instinctual impulses autoerotically by obtaining organ pleasure. It is originally narcissistic, then passes over onto objects, which have been incorporated into the extended ego, and expresses the motor efforts of the ego towards these objects as sources of pleasure. It becomes intimately linked with the activity of the later sexual instincts, and when these have been completely synthesized, coincides with the sexual impulsion as a whole. Preliminary stages of love emerge as provisional sexual aims, while the sexual instincts are passing through their complicated development. As the first of these aims, we recognize the phase of incorporating or devouring, a type of love which is consistent with abolishing the object's separate existence and which may therefore be described as ambivalent. Footnote 1. Freud's first published account of the oral stage was given in a paragraph added to the third, 1915 edition of his 3 essays, Standard Edition, Volume 7, page 198. The preface to that edition is dated October 1914, some months before the present paper was written. See also below, page 249, and the pages which follow. Returning to the main text. As the first of these aims, we recognize the phase of incorporating or devouring, a type of love which is consistent with abolishing the object's separate existence, and which may therefore be described as ambivalent. At the higher stage of the pregenital sadistic anal organization, the striving for the object appears in the form of an urge for mastery, to which injury or annihilation of the object is a matter of indifference. Footnote 1. See the Disposition to Obsessional Neurosis, 1913I. At the higher stage of the pregenital sadistic anal organization, the striving for the object appears in the form of an urge for mastery, to which injury or annihilation of the object is a matter of indifference. Love in this form, and at this preliminary stage, is hardly to be distinguished from hate in its attitude towards the object. Not until the genital organization is established does love become the opposite of hate. Hate, as a relation to objects, is older than love. It derives from the narcissistic ego's primordial repudiation of the external world with its outpouring of stimuli, as an expression of the reaction of unpleasure evoked by objects. It always remains in an intimate relation with the self-preservative instincts, so that sexual and ego instincts can readily develop an antithesis which repeats that of love and hate. When the ego instincts dominate the sexual function, as is the case at the stage of the sadistic anal organization, they impart the qualities of hate to the instinctual aim as well. The history of the origins and relations of love make us understand how it is that love so frequently manifests itself as ambivalent, i.e., as accompanied by impulses of hate against the same object. Footnote 2. See footnote 2, page 131. The hate which is admixed with the love is in part derived from the preliminary stages of loving, which have not been wholly surmounted. It is also in part based on reactions of repudiation by the ego instincts, which, in view of the frequent conflicts between the interests of the ego and those of love, can find grounds in real and contemporary motives. In both cases, therefore, the admixed hate has as its source the self-preservative instincts. If a love relation with a given object is broken off, hate not infrequently emerges in its place, so that we get the impression of a transformation of love into hate. This account of what happens leads on to the view that the hate, which has its real motives, is here reinforced by a regression of the love to the sadistic preliminary stage, so that the hate acquires an erotic character, and the continuity of a love relation is ensured. The third antithesis of loving, the transformation of loving into being loved, footnote 3, see footnote 1, page 135. The third antithesis of loving, the transformation of loving into being loved, corresponds to the operation of the polarity of activity and passivity, and is to be judged in the same way as the cases of scopophilia and sadism. Footnote 1. The relation between love and hate was further discussed by Freud in the light of his hypothesis of a death instinct in Chapter 4 of The Ego and the Id, 1923b. The third antithesis of loving, the transformation of loving into being loved, corresponds to the operation of the polarity of activity and passivity, and is to be judged in the same way as the cases of scopophilia and sadism. We may sum up by saying that the essential feature in the vicissitudes undergone by instincts lies in the subjection of the instinctual impulses to the influences of the three great polarities that dominate mental life. Of these three polarities, we might describe that of activity-passivity as the biological, that of ego-external world as the real, and finally, that of pleasure-unpleasure as the economic polarity. The instinctual vicissitude of repression will form the subject of an inquiry which follows in the next paper. End of Instincts and their Vicissitudes.